This video is sponsored by Squarespace.
Is using a full-frame sensor a good idea for deep sky astrophotography? I wish I could just tell you yes or no, but like most things with astrophotography, the answer is actually more complex than that, and it depends on several factors. So in this video, we're going to break down all the considerations, everything you should think about before diving in to full-frame imaging. And to give you a better idea of what to expect with full-frame, I'll be showing real results I've captured from 3 different full-frame cameras. My name is Nico Carver, and this is Nebula Photos. When I started deep sky astrophotography 10 years ago, I was using the only photo camera I owned at the time, which was this one. This is the Canon 5D Mark III. And this DSLR has a full frame sensor. And I remember hearing from a few different people, probably mostly online, oh, you don't want to use a full frame for deep sky astrophotography. They don't work as well as crop sensors. And I don't think I really understood why people were saying that. But in any case, this was my only option, the Canon 5D. So it was the one that I used. And at the time, I will say I was very happy with the results. So I didn't quite understand why full frame cameras had this bad reputation among some astrophotographers. And, now 10 years later, I do think I know why full frame got a bad rap back then. And a lot of it was about the kinds of telescopes that we were using back then, what was available, at least inexpensively, and many of them were designed primarily for visual use, and they didn't support full-frame imaging just because the image circle that the telescope would create wasn't large enough, so you'd get this really bad vignetting, and so then it's just sort of a waste to use full-frame. Of course, nowadays there are many telescopes available that truly do support full-frame imaging, and I've reviewed many of these telescopes on the channel. But just because it's possible to go full-frame with your telescope doesn't mean it's necessarily the right choice for you. And since this is partly a review, let me disclose that this new ASA 4400MC was sent to me by ZWO to test for them, which I've been doing for a few months. No money has exchanged hands, and they have no say in what I share in this video. So let's start with what full frame even means. It refers to the physical size of the camera sensor. And that size for full frame is 36 millimeters wide by 24 millimeters high, approximately. So why those numbers? Because it's roughly the same dimensions as 35 millimeter format film. And that became the most prevalent film format. For the average person, they would never go to a larger format film than that. And that has stayed true with digital cameras. For most people, full frame is the largest digital sensor they'll ever consider. But of course, there are smaller formats, the most popular being APS-C, often just called a crop sensor. And then down from there, we have micro four thirds. And then there are many, many smaller sensor types. They're most commonly used today in phones, security cameras, industrial applications, all kinds of things like that. Your car camera, all these little things. But we also see these very small sensors in dedicated Astro cameras. So full frame just means a sensor that's about 36 by 24 millimeters in physical diameter. That's not the largest digital sensor you can get, but it's the largest that the most amateur astrophotographers would consider. Now, what does changing the physical sensor size change about your image? It changes the field of view. And that means how much of the night sky you are capturing at once without mosaics, just in a single frame. But there is another way that you can change your field of view, which is changing the telescope or the lens that you're using. So a shorter focal length will increase your field of view, taking in more of the night sky, and a longer focal length will decrease your field of view, taking in a smaller section of the sky at once. So to decide on a camera and telescope combination, you have to first think about what you're most interested in capturing and how big that appears in our night sky. So for example, most galaxies, other than a few of our local neighboring galaxies and planetary nebulae and star clusters and many other things, are pretty small in apparent diameter. So a small field of view will work just fine. While other objects like emission nebulae and many supernova remnants, these are very dim objects, but they're also very large often. So a large field of view is is what you want. So let's say you want this large field of view. There's always going to be two ways to achieve a larger field of view without using the mosaic technique: lower focal length or a larger sensor. So as an example, let's say I wanted to fit all of the Orion and Running Man nebulae in frame in one picture. If I did this with the small IMX585 sensor, I'm limited to about 150 millimeter focal length to fit them both in. But if I did this with a full frame sensor, I can now be at 500 millimeter focal length, meaning a lot of telescope choices, a much bigger aperture telescope capable of resolving smaller details. So while the two images may look basically the same all the way zoomed out like this, when we zoom in, the one done with the full frame sensor and a much bigger telescope clearly shows more detail, even though these are the same field of view. So this is really the reason for full frame. If you match the field of view to a smaller sensor, it means that you're going to use a larger telescope. And that means you will have better details, better resolution. So win-win, right? Why aren't full frame sensors the norm in deep sky astrophotography? Well, to explain that, we need to go through some recent history of amateur astrophotography. When I was getting started in this hobby 10 years ago, there were very few affordable telescopes available that were designed primarily for astrophotographers. They were out there, but they were more expensive. The astrographs were generally more expensive. And the affordable telescopes were designed primarily for visual astronomy, with astrophotography as a secondary concern if it was thought of at all. In the past 10 years, this has really flipped because astrophotography has gotten way more popular. So now there are tons of telescope options primarily designed for astrophotography, with visual astronomy more as the afterthought. And these astrophotography type telescopes are available at every size and price point. And the majority of these new telescopes coming out for photography will now support a full frame sensor, meaning the image circle will at least illuminate a full frame sensor, and many will actually be pretty well corrected with a full frame sensor. Well corrected in this sense means the stars will be fairly round and sharp even in the corners of a full frame image. But 10 years ago, that was not the case. There were a lot of telescopes that could work for APS-C, but far fewer that worked for full frame. So this is one of the reasons people said to stay away from full frame, because there again were very few affordable telescopes back then that could fully support full frame imaging. Okay, so that makes sense. But then over the past 10 years, as we've seen more and more affordable telescopes that can support full frame come onto the market, why haven't full frame cameras like these for astrophotography really taken off? And I think what's going on there is there's been a trend towards everything getting smaller and cheaper and easier to use. So where we are now, if you're a beginner getting into astrophotography, is the $600 smart scope with a 30 millimeter aperture and a very small sensor. And people are finding that's good enough, good enough to take nice quality images for at least social media. And I totally get this. If I was asked blind on my phone, which well-processed image is from the smart scope and which is from a traditional rig, and I can't zoom in, I probably really couldn't tell you which is which. It's only when we put images like this on a larger computer monitor or print them out at 2 feet wide or something that you could really start seeing all of these differences in the smaller details that we gain from using a bigger telescope. So that's the other reason, is that the trend in astrophotography over the past 10 years that I've been in it is everything getting smaller, more convenient, easier to use, and full frame is going in the opposite direction. So why would you consider a full frame camera? Well, in terms of image quality, the biggest aperture that we can use for a given field of view, the more small detail you'll capture, and that leads, in most people's eyes, I think, to better image quality. This is where going with a larger sensor with a larger telescope is always going to beat a smaller sensor with a smaller telescope, given the same field of view. Okay, so there are some pros when it comes to image quality if you can afford to go with a bigger sensor and a bigger telescope. But the thing many of us will immediately think of there is the cost of going bigger. Because whenever you go bigger in this hobby, you're going to pay more, and not just more, but way more. It's like an exponential curve. So larger telescope means larger mount, larger camera sensor means larger filters. It's the whole kit price that is going to go way up. And the price difference on these things, especially when you add everything up, can be pretty crazy. Like I could put together 2 rigs that have the same field of view and spend $3,000 on one and $30,000 on the other, same field of view. And so a lot of times how much all of this costs is going to be the deciding factor in how big a camera sensor you want, because all of these costs are interconnected when you put together a kit. And for many people, going to APS-C, a crop sensor, is plenty big enough, and generally that is where I'd advise people to go if they want a fairly large sensor. However, if you're into big nebulae, really large fields of view, and your issue with astrophotography is a shortage of clear nights rather than a shortage of funds to spend on equipment, then full frame imaging can start making more and more sense. Okay, and one thing we haven't gotten to at all yet is pixel size. I've debated including this at all, but it's going to come up when we start comparing the cameras, so let's get into it a little bit. The physical size of a single photosite on the sensor determines the total number of pixels in the image. So if a full-frame camera has large photosites, like with this Sony ZV-E1 that are 8.4 microns across, that means the total number of pixels in the images produced by this camera is 12 million or 12 megapixels. While on the other side, the ASI 6200MC has photosites that are very small at 3.76 microns in size, giving it a total pixel count of 61 million. So 5 times more than the Sony ZV-E1. So that sounds like a huge difference, 12 versus 61 million pixels. But for astrophotography, the actual difference it will have on the smallest details you can capture is going to be a lot more complicated. To generalize, if your main goal is to eke out very small details, then the combination of a small pixel camera, a large aperture telescope, and excellent sky conditions, excellent seeing, meaning the turbulence in the atmosphere is calm and smooth, that's going to be the way to get those small details in your image. But for many of us, we are physically locked to a certain location. We're limited by the seeing of our location. And so before we can take advantage of smaller pixels or bigger telescopes, we'd actually have to move our whole setup to somewhere with better sky conditions. So it gets really complicated. Now let's turn to these cameras. I've had this one the longest, the Canon EOS RA. This is more of a general purpose camera because of course it can do regular photography with lenses a lot easier than you could with these. It has an actual grip for holding it. It can do video. And it can do video so well. This was my main video camera even for YouTube for a couple of years. But it can also, of course, do deep sky astrophotography. I've reviewed this camera previously, so I won't repeat a bunch of stuff here, partly because it's discontinued. So I don't want to get your hopes up about this camera because it's actually pretty hard to find now. You'll occasionally see them pop up on the used market. But these two cameras from ZWO are available, and these are definitely more specialized deep sky cameras. This is what these two cameras are really good at. But in that, they do have features that can beat out the Canon for deep sky. The sensors are less noisy. Overall, they have less read noise, and they have set point cooling. That's why there's these fans in the back. And this is nice for basically eliminating dark current. The set point cooling also makes calibration frames super easy. So there's a lot of advantages of having cooling on a camera for deep sky astrophotography. This one, the ASI 6200MC, uses the Sony IMX455 sensor, which is a very impressive 61 megapixel sensor that has similar characteristics to the IMX571 and the IMX533 in that they all have low noise, hardly any dark current, no appreciable amp glow, pretty small pixels at 3.76 micron. So overall, just very good sensors in 3 different sizes. And the ASI 6200MC was released in late 2019, so about 6 years ago. It's proven pretty popular. for a full frame camera, but it's also pretty expensive at $4,000. So this new camera, this is the ASI 4400MC, looks pretty interesting because it's a full $1,000 less expensive, but it uses a newer sensor actually from Sony called the IMX366, which has 4.4 micron pixels, so slightly larger than the ASI 6200, but it's still, I would consider, a high megapixel camera at 44 megapixels. So it should be an interesting comparison. And I have two comparisons. So for the first comparison, the Witch Head Nebula at 264 millimeter focal length, the Astro SQA55, I have data from all three cameras I just mentioned. For the second comparison of the Horsehead Nebula at 840 millimeter focal length with the Skywatcher Esprit 120, I was only able to get data with the two ZWO cameras due to clouds coming in. And then since then, I've just not had a clear night. So let's jump in and take a look at what I've captured.
So these were all taken with the same telescope, which is the Astro SQA55, from the same location, and these are identical amounts of integration. I also processed them identically. And I wanted to start here with this zoomed out view showing the full picture to emphasize that when you are this far zoomed out, and like this is sort of be like the view you got on a smartphone or something, they are going to look remarkably similar because you're getting the full field of view. The field of view is roughly the same between the three cameras. And this far zoomed out, it's hard to see any differences at all. So the main difference between these three cameras, other than the fact that the Canon RA isn't a cooled Astro camera, is the pixel size. And so the Canon RA has the biggest pixels, the ASI 6200MC has the smallest pixels, and the ASI 4400MC is somewhere in between. Okay, this becomes a lot more apparent if we put all three pictures at 100% zoom level. And you may have thought if we put all three cameras at 100% zoom that they're going to stay fairly identical. But no, what happens is the highest megapixel camera looks the most zoomed in. And the reason that happens is because at 100% zoom, 1 pixel from the camera equals 1 pixel on your monitor. And so since there's more pixels from the high megapixel camera, a smaller section of the picture takes up more screen real estate. Well, this one, since the pixels are bigger, we get more of the picture at 100% zoom. And this is sometimes deceptive when you're making these kinds of comparisons, because I think that a lot of people will find that this 100% zoom looks better than this one because it's more zoomed out. And so it gives this idea of sharpness. It's a perceptual thing. When something is more zoomed out on a monitor like this, it looks sharper than this one that looks maybe blurrier. But actually, this one has a lot more actual detail. So if we scaled this picture, I'll just try to do it here. Okay, that's pretty good. To about the same size as this one, I think hopefully you can see that there's actually more detail over here. Well, this one actually now looks blurrier. But when we were back at 100%, I feel like this one actually looks sharper. So this is just a perceptual difference. It's just the way that our brain works. Does any of this matter? Yes, because we're going to go into a bunch of different comparisons between these three cameras, many of them zoomed in like this, but we have to be aware of this perceptual difference. Now, you might be wondering, in telescope shootouts, I often am just registering things so that they look identical, the different views from the different telescopes. That's okay, I think, for telescope reviews, but for a camera comparison, I don't want to do that because the whole point of this is that this is the same optics and we have three different cameras. So this true view of what the cameras are producing is important. I don't want to interpolate the pixels just so that we match the lowest megapixel camera to the highest or the highest to the lowest, because that really doesn't give us a true sense of the differences in the cameras. But the trade-off is you have to be aware of just this sort of perceptual challenge with a high megapixel camera at 100% zoom is going to look more zoomed in than a low megapixel camera. Okay, so with all of that said, I think we can move on to more comparisons here, and we'll jump over to PixInsight to do this. Okay, so the first comparison I wanted to make was just show you some single exposures. These have been calibrated, but not any kind of processing done on them, no gradient correction. So you can see there is a sky gradient with these. Here's the ASI 6200. I'll make it full screen so you can take a look. Now here's the ASI 4400 MC. I'll also make this full screen. And then here is the Canon RA. Okay, now we'll do the same thing for a dark frames, but let me actually talk about these a little bit. So here's the 6200 dark, and a lot of people shooting the ASI 6200 or 2600 or some of these other modern sensors like this don't even shoot darks because all these hot pixels will actually be taken care of if you dither. All these hot pixels will disappear, and there's no amp glow whatsoever. That meaning that if we look at the edges of the frame, they're just as uniform as the center. Now here's the new ASI 4400 MC, and we can see there is a little bit of amp glow on the sides, on the left and right edge. Now that might be so minimal that if you do dither, which I'd recommend, and then you have to crop in a little bit to get rid of the dithering artifacts, that will also remove any of this amp glow. So you might still not have to take dark frames in that case. However, I would probably recommend taking dark frames with the ASI 4400 MC just to make sure that it takes care of any of that amp glow, because that's one of the main reasons to take darks if your camera is exhibiting any amp glow. This is very minimal, so I want to emphasize that. It's not like worrisome amount of amp glow, but it does have a little bit on the edges, as does the Canon RA, just a little bit on each edge. Okay, now we're going to look at the stacks of so about 90 minutes each. So this is, again, without any processing. Here's the 6200, here's the 4400, and here is the Canon RA. And again, hopefully you can see from these stacks that these are remarkably similar results. So that's why my processed results look so similar. The only big giveaway with the Canon RA is even though I was using a filter to try to control this, it still has this red offset halo around Rigel, which is pretty annoying. It's not too bad to deal with in processing, but you can see the two Astro cameras from ZWO have absolutely no artifact around that bright star Rigel, which is very nice. Okay, now we're looking at the aberration inspector at about 300 or 400% zoom. So this is a torture test on the stars. The SQA55 is a very good scope for full frame imaging. You can see with the RA, these stars look a little bit undersampled, a little bit blocky, but basically round. With the ASI 4400, they look a little bit better, less blocky, but also pretty round. And with the ASI 6200, we're starting to see a little bit more of aberration. Basically, the stars look a little bit elongated in the corner. So I feel that this does show that if you really are a pixel peeper, like I've often said, the ASI 6200 with its very small pixels is going to be the most demanding of all sort of modern sensors, unless you go up to medium format or bigger. But the ASI 6200, it's unusual in a full frame camera to be that high megapixel, to have pixels that small. So it really does show any little problem with the telescope. This is still a very good result, not one that I would worry about personally, but I just wanted to show that with a small pixel camera at full frame, it's going to maybe show a little bit more of the aberrations than if you use one with bigger pixels. Okay, now we're looking at a related question, but slightly different, which is, does a high megapixel camera, one with smaller pixels, show more detail with the same telescope compared to one with lower megapixel, one with bigger pixels? And so I thought this little background galaxy in these stars was a good sample of this kind of detail comparison. And I would say with this little barred spiral galaxy, I'm not seeing a huge difference between the three cameras. When we look at close stars, like stars that are very close together, that's where we can start seeing a little bit more of a difference. So, for instance, here, right there is like two stars that are very close together. And they're so close together that with the RA and its big pixels, I really don't see any separation between this small star and the star right next to it. With the 4400, you definitely do see that that's two distinct stars. And with the 6200, same thing. So I guess I would say that with the RA, there are some very small details that are being missed because of its much bigger pixels. Between the ASI 4400 and the ASI 6200, it's much harder to see any difference in terms of the amount of detail that these two cameras are capturing. But all three of these are technically what we call undersampled. So for the next test, I use a much bigger telescope. These were taken with the Esprit 120, and we get to much closer to well-sampled details, well-sampled stars. Now, unfortunately, I ran out of time and wasn't able to do the Canon RA, but I think that the main comparison here that's interesting is actually these two, since they're pretty close together, and probably someone who is buying a new full frame color deep sky camera today would probably be choosing between these two, the 4400 or the 6200. But there's a whole $1,000 price difference between these. So we'll see if that really bears out. Now, you will see that there's a slight color difference, especially visible in the reds here between the 6200, which has a little bit more of a richer red, and the 4400, which has a little bit more of a less saturated red. I wouldn't put too much stock into that. I didn't do any color management on this other than just aligning the color channels with the auto stretch. So you could obviously apply color correction to these images and they probably would end up looking a lot more similar. But I just wanted to show you the raw results straight from camera. I don't really know how to account for that slight difference in the saturation of the reds in the cameras. So anyways, what I wanted to, this is the full frame image, basically very similar. It looks like the 4400 caught a bright star right on the edge of the telescope. So we have a little bit of a flare there, but that's nothing to do with the camera. It's just that I caught a little bit of a bright flare. And for some reason with the 6200, I didn't catch that. Now let's look at the aberration inspector. And what I found interesting here, which is the Esprit 120 is such a well-corrected telescope that you really, even with the very high megapixel 6200 MC, these stars look basically perfect in the corner. You can tell they're very well sampled, but they also just look perfectly round, showing no false color. And then comparing that to the 4400, again, they look a little bit sharper with the 4400, but that's just that perceptual effect of a difference at 100% view. I think these stars are actually very similar between the two cameras, and we're not really getting that same effect of the 6200 showing more aberration like we did with the SQA55. And that just goes to show how good the Esprit 120 is as a telescope that actually does support full frame imaging fully. Okay, and then the detail test, which is just a slightly different test than the aberration test. Again, here between the 4400 and the 6200, now at a much more what we would call well sampled, around 1 arcsecond per pixel. Here, I really see very little difference in the amount of detail captured between the two. If I look at sort of, different little stars, dimmer stars in the picture, all the dimmer stars that are in the 6200 are also showing up in the 4400. Really, the only difference, other than the red color being slightly different between these two images that I see, is that I feel like in the dimmest structures, like if you look at this dim structure in the horse head right here, compared to the 6200, I feel like the signal to noise ratio is slightly better with the 4400, which would maybe make sense with slightly bigger pixels. Other than that, these are so similar that my final conclusion is if you're looking for a full frame color Astro camera, I would really just save money and get the 4400 MC. The only other consideration is that if you are trying to match the 6200 MC to the 6200 mm, like let's say you have both cameras and you're doing some kind of combinations where you have shot the HA with the 6200 mm, and then you're shooting the color RGB information with the one-shot color 6200 MC. To match those two sensors together more perfectly, that's where I could see buying the 6200 MC. But if you're just buying one color camera, you're not worried about matching it to a mono camera, then the 4400 MC, I think, just from a price perspective, really makes a lot of sense because it's capturing really just as much detail pretty much as the 6200, but again, for $1,000 less. So after you've captured all these beautiful photons with whatever camera you're using, what do you actually do with the pictures? What I like to do is I put them on my personal website, nicocarver.com. And for that, I use today's sponsor, Squarespace. Squarespace is an all-in-one place to get your own website going, and you can do it without any coding knowledge because Squarespace makes that easy with their professional templates and their drag and drop design system called Squarespace Blueprint. I can quickly change anything on my site through intuitive controls, and everything updates immediately. It's drag and drop, and then I can just see the changes and decide if I like them. And I also really like that everything I need to do with my website is built in and ready to go. Because right away I could start using a spam-free contact form. And if I ever needed to sell anything on my website, Squarespace will have me covered because it has really good selling tools, and I can sell services or products or whatever I need to sell right on my website. And then there's plenty of options for payment for the customer, from PayPal to credit card to Afterpay. So if you need a website, check out squarespace.com/nebulaphotos for your free trial. And if you like it, use code nebulaphotos at checkout for 10% off your first purchase of hosting or a domain. Since this video is over 20 minutes long, you're now seeing the names of everyone who supports this channel on patreon.com/nebulaphotos. Patreon members get a bunch of exclusive benefits like a monthly bonus video and the growing backlog of past bonus videos, one-on-one messaging support with me, tons of additional channels on my Discord server, which is a 24/7 chat room. And that includes my monthly imaging challenge if you're interested in participating. You also get a Zoom call with me and the whole Patreon community the first Sunday of every month. So I think my Patreon, which starts at just $1 a month, would be well worth checking out if you appreciate what I'm offering here on this YouTube channel. And as always, this has been Nico Carver signing off. Clear skies.